Hi, I'm Nancy Bavor, and welcome to today's Textile Talk. I'm the director of the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, and we're proud to be the presenting organization this week. And I'm delighted to introduce the presentation, Restoring Textiles with Kira Dominguez Hultgren. And for those of you who are joining for the first time, Textile Talks is a weekly virtual lecture series presented by 6 different fiber arts organizations each Wednesday: Studio Art Quilt Associates, the International Quilt Museum, Surface Design Association, Modern Quilt Guild, Quilt Alliance, and the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. And today's presentation and questions and answers will last about an hour. So that we can continue to offer the talks for free, I hope you'll consider making a donation to or becoming a member of the presenting organization. And we'll put a link in the chat, or you can visit the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles website. Please use the Q&A button for the questions and the chat box for greeting others, and the post-event survey for commentary and constructive feedback. And if you prefer not to see notifications from the chat, you can click on that button and toggle them on or off. And we also respectfully ask you to be courteous as you engage with speakers, moderators, and other participants. We're proud to be supported by the following organizations and businesses who make our weekly lecture series possible: Aurifil, Handy Quilter, The Quilt Show, Misty Fuse, Artistic Artifacts, Schiffer Publishing, eQuilter, Moda Fabrics and Supplies, Nine Patch Fabrics, Empty Spool Seminars, Quilt Mania, and C&T Publishing. And we encourage you all to patronize these businesses when you can. I just want to take a moment to share some of the exciting virtual events we have coming up at San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles. In April, we'll have classes on designing and selling your own fabric with Becca Ron, which has already sold out, and we are looking at having another one later in this year. And then promoting your artwork on social media with Stephen Wagner, where there is still space available. In May and June, we've also had some workshops on reverse applique with Shanglore. Again, sold out, but we're working on a possible workshop, second workshop with her, so stay tuned. And mid-century modern inspired mini quilts with David Owen Hastings, and there is still space in that class. And we have also scheduled another natural dyeing class with our artist in residence, Carolina Cuevas, so watch out for that in June. And to learn more about these events or register, check out our website, and we'll put the URL in the chat. So now I'm delighted to introduce today's speaker, Kira Dominguez Hultgren, who will be discussing her solo exhibition, I Was India, Embroidering Exoticism, which opened at the museum in March of 2020 for about 6 days. It was not open very long, and I'm pleased to announce that we plan to reopen with her exhibition. In addition to highlighting the stunning woven sculptures and fiber installations inspired by the artist's family stories and materials, Kira's exhibit will also explore the importance of arts-based research in her work and how her creative practice intersects craft and contemporary art. We're delighted to also welcome Kira's dealer, Eleanor Harwood, of the Eleanor Harwood Gallery here in San Francisco, who will join the artist in conversation. Kira Dominguez Hultgren is a textile artist and educator who currently lives in Chicago, where she teaches at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in fiber and material studies. She received a BA in comparative literature at Princeton University and a dual degree in MFA and MA in fine arts and visual and critical studies from the California College of Arts. Kira's work has been exhibited at the de Young Museum in San Francisco, headlined Untitled Art SF in 2020, and was featured in the July-August 2020 issue of Architectural Digest. She has had 2 solo shows with Eleanor Harwood Gallery in San Francisco, where she is represented, and her first solo museum show at the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles in 2020. Her fellowships and residencies include the Headland Center for the Arts, Facebook, and Gensler Architecture. And so we're so excited to have her here today to share more. So take it away, Kira.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you to the museum and Textile Talks for inviting me to speak with you today. I want to begin by telling a story about weaving. And let me first share my screen. There we go. And to think through some of the theoretical underpinnings by which I view, read, and make textiles. Having gathered this material, I'll then walk us through the show at the museum, I Was India, Embroidering Exoticism, and finally speak a bit more broadly about my practice and research. The story begins when I was living in Argentina. It begins with Mapuche Argentine weaver and community agitator Marie Coronado of Machine Ahogado at her loom. Picture me standing in the circle formed by Marie's arms, her back pressed up against mine, her breath strong with mate, chin resting on my shoulders, and her laugh and stories loud in my ears as our hands were buried together in the loom. I can't tell you the number of hours we stood like this in 2011 and 12, her watching me struggle to figure out the pattern, telling me to listen to the wool. Teaching without any written instructions or patterns to follow, she insisted that the weaving will, quote, tell you where it wants to go next, end quote. And she didn't mean that metaphorically. She was talking about the way the fabric was held by the loom, talking about the feel of the yarn under tension on my fingers and how it felt differently depending on if I chose to pick up or drop a yarn strand at any given moment. This is me weaving in my apartment in Berkeley, California, and that's my daughter watching me from the chair. Marie taught me to think through each step of weaving in my body. What would happen to the structure of the fabric, the image, the pattern? It became a choreography between me and the loom, but also between her, me, the history of Mapuche weaving through her mother, our shared experiences of performing misrecognized ethnic and racial difference, the choreography between wool, war, spindle, the pattern, everything. The fabric became a recording of this woven dance, of hands moving with material under tension. Cultural theorist Sadie Plant says of woven structure that what is visible in a weaving is a record of the process that made it. It marks a series of traceable interactions between maker, material, and loom, which means that Marie didn't just teach me how to weave. She taught me how to enter into a programmable structure and change it, disrupt it. She taught me how to approach stored information and restory it through my body. For instance, through weaving At Least Both Your Parents Are Brown, I can construct and occupy checkboxes that seek to divide brown into racial and ethnic categories on demographic questionnaires, while at the same time changing the terms by which that mark is understood. Race on this census record from 1930 shows my grandmother's family marked, crossed out, marked again, and crossed out again. Through warp and weft, I can enter into my family history of confused checkboxes, of misstored and misaligned identities, and restory not just my family's history, but challenge the narratives of race, immigration, and exoticism in America. Woven on a Jacquard loom, a digital hand loom, the source imagery for this piece, Oakland Native, the land of my birth, is from the University of California, Berkeley Botanical Garden. Photos I took while walking around with my middle schoolers, talking about collected, displayed, and labeled plant menageries on unceded Ohlone lands in the Oakland Hills. But when hung in my studio, this piece inevitably prompts questions of whether or not my family is Hawaiian. My grandmother passed away in 2016, but had you met her, she would have greeted you with Sat Sri Akal, a Punjabi greeting, and at some point early in the conversation, she would have danced pearly shells for you. Even later in life, when she was in a wheelchair, she could hula dance. My grandmother was born in LA in the 1920s and was the embodiment of exotic difference. She was raised in a vaudeville stage family who were cast as Native Hawaiian in the movies. It was a way that Hollywood was reflecting the US's need to make sense of the consequences of slavery, miscegenation, and now babies who were both Black and white. Hawaii became the space where in between skin and hair, the brown body was fun, exotic, at once not the US and becoming the US. To embody the acceptable parts of exotic difference in the US was both a passing privilege and burden for my grandmother, who in the next generation sought to give her children a chance to be, in her words, quote, mostly something. This piece, Horizon Lines, is a material trace from my grandmother's story of marrying a Punjabi immigrant, sailing on ships around the world, and having mostly Punjabi children. I wove one of my grandmother's Punjabi suits, the white and black fabric seen here at the top of this piece, together with one of my own, a blue Punjabi suit that my mother wore and then passed to me. Together, they form what is called in weaving a supplementary discontinuous warp, vertical lines that are broken, interlocking but not continuous, held together by weft or fill material, the horizontal lines, seen here as yarn, various rods, and climbing gym rope. And this is what I love about weaving. Physically, there are no blended lines. The vertical and the horizontal move in opposite directions, working together, but also against one another. Each strand holds its own, and yet its position is contingent on every other strand around it. A balance in tension with itself. To show that balance, to show the record of the weaving process, I often leave the tools used to weave the fabric in the final piece. This is as much a fabric as it is a loom. As my grandmother sailed around the world, the possessions that she could fit in steamer trunks and carry with her became coveted tactile memories that she would unpack and talk about any time I was with her. Two of these fabrics were her sister-in-laws, my great aunts, Pukaris, or salus as my family calls them. Pukaris, meaning flower-shaped, is the embroidery technique typical of Punjab and northern India and Pakistan. These two salus were embroidered by my great aunt Dalip Kaur, probably in the early to mid 1920s when she was 13 and living in Jandiala, India. They're what I can point to when people ask me, oh, did you learn how to weave, to sew from the women in your family? And the answer is no, their hands were not the ones on mine showing me textile techniques. But the answer is also yes. When I see my great aunt's work and can trace and follow her stitches around the cloth, remember Sadie Plant's assertion that textiles are a record, a set of instructions of their making process. And when I remember my grandmother's hands as she danced pearly shells in a Punjabi suit, I think, yes, I did learn to textile from the women in my family. I learned pieced together, embroidered, contradictions held in tension, woven, textiled stories. No wonder when I went to Argentina and met Marie, who, like my grandmother, embodied so many different and seemingly at odds cultures and expressed it through her weaving, through her fabric, my hands and heart got it way faster than my head did. This was a dance that felt familiar. And for this show at the museum, I wanted to think through that dance as expressed in my great aunt's embroidery by way of the history, landscape, stories, and the training which forms my gaze and response to it. There are many things that caught my attention as I examined my Aunt Dalipi's work. The first was her decision to stitch her name and biographical details into the border of this cloth. I've yet to find another example of Pukari where a message is inscribed in the border. What was her motivation? Was she signing the fabric, ensuring, like a journal entry left in the cloth, this work would be read not just as a symbol of Punjabi material culture, but a textile documenting and materializing her design decisions? And this embroidery is a reflection of her, but it's also a reflection of a pivotal moment in post-colonial history. Pulkari embroidery is done in silk onto brown khadi cloth, the hand-spun, hand-woven cotton that was becoming a marker for Gandhi's revolution and Indian independence, happening at the same moment Dalipi is embroidering this cloth. Did she know the history she was intersecting, embodying? Perhaps, But rather than reading this as a fixed marker or symbol for Indian material culture at the time of the revolution, how instead does this become one girl's journal, vision, portal, opening up to a future generation? Me, I was here. These stitches mark her motions, her decisions through the cloth. So how do I enter into her history? My first move was to zoom in on this tiny 2" by 2" pattern Dalipi created, taking stitches done in millimeters and turning them into oversized motions caught up on frame bars held by climbing gym ropes and cam straps. Rather than embroidery, my motions in textiles are woven, using oversized materials to help the viewer see where materials get buried, emerge, are held in tension, or are let loose. Thinking through what embroidery does, finding the holes created at the intersections in a fabric and moving counter perpendicularly through these interactions, the installation of this piece, I hope, invites the viewer similarly into the cloth, allowing the viewer to feel the motion and tension of the thread as it moves back and forth, the push and the pull. This work, while appearing to be whole, is actually 8 weavings woven together, reflecting the brown khadi cloth onto which my aunt embroidered. Khadi too is woven in parts, in panels that are then stitched together. One thing I love about weaving is that the width of the loom does not determine the whole fabric. It only determines the width of one cloth. Corresponding to its structure, a woven fabric can be made of many parts coming together. Like Pukari embroidery, the colorful blocks of weaving done in rows are covering over an equal amount of brown woven fabric. If you were to turn this piece around, anywhere you see color, it would be brown. Here you can see the plain khadi cloth with only the barest outline of stitched silk from the Pukari embroidery. The relationship between the khadi or backing fabric and how it is intersected and embellished became the guiding metaphor for this show. What is my backing fabric, the cultural historical fabric, and how do I enter into it? The Porcella Gallery of the museum helpfully already had a woven brown carpeting onto which I could weave a second brown khadi carpeting and stick my jacquard woven patchwork of Pukari flowers. In Small World, after all, I wanted to poke fun a little bit and also question the framing around which Indian material culture is put to use in the US by my family, the museum, and me. How does the construction of India and exoticism become its own backing khadi fabric? Is there room to separate from it, to find the spaces in between the pieced together panels of fabric that form Indianness? In this piece, I Was India, I wanted to use weaving as a way of laying out, maybe airing out, the construction of Indian American identity and exoticism in my mother's generation. This piece began on the loom as one layer. The point or spine on the piece, visible on the right, is then split into 2 loosely woven layers, what I'll refer to as the chintz layer and the khadi layer. The layer facing us here, the chintz layer, has jacquard woven strips of floral fabric loosely woven into the cotton, ramie, and linen web. It's a reference to my grandmother, who later in life called herself, quote, the last rose of summer. But it's also a reference to how the floral Pukari design intersected the floral chintz design, also an Indian textile technique. Chintz historically was made using a floral woodblock print on woven Indian cotton that was then exported to the UK and later around the world. Chintz is still a popular pattern of fabric today, but its history is pretty gruesome, especially the effects it had on Indian weavers. The history is actually one of the reasons Gandhi decided to empower weavers in rural India to return to the loom and weave their own cotton. The second layer of this piece is my own version of khadi, a restored, storied, reclaimed, respun version of history turned into a backing cloth onto which I can embroider. Images and histories of my mother and her siblings as they represented India and Asia, riding on elephants in Disneyland parades of the 1960s, fill the second layer. My mother was part of the 1966 opening ceremonies for It's a Small World ride at Disneyland and rode in the first boat with Walt Disney. Woven in are photographs of this event, where she stands at 12 years old with 5 other girls representing 6 of the 7 continents. The performance of Indianness, of racial and ethnic otherness, of exoticism, in my mother's words, was, quote, all that was acceptable at the time. In other words, my mother was the acceptable part of Southeast Asian, like her mother, who was the acceptable part of Black, brown, and white. If the acceptable part is the khadi fabric I've been given, how do I enter in, cover over, hide, disrupt, or restory the acceptable fabric of exoticism in my generation? Well, happily, I'm not the first artist to wrestle with these questions of using textile techniques to disrupt cultural and institutional narratives of fabrics. I'm stepping into a trajectory of makers within contemporary art, past and present, who have used textiles to trouble definitions of race and nationalism, fixed gender roles, fixed definitions of fine art, craft, and material culture. I'd like to briefly look at one of these definition troubling makers and their work titled Loom with Textile by the Smithsonian. Loom with Textile was woven most likely between 1864 and 74 by Navajo leader and weaver Juanita Atza-Talagi. It has hugely influenced both my making practice and my understanding of what weaving does and can do. Although the Smithsonian labels this work an unfinished US flag blanket, I see this piece intentionally left on the loom to show how the symbol of the flag is an ongoing construction tied to a machine, the loom, that operates to bury the nations and people with whom it comes in contact. Juanita both visualizes and enacts this burial through the loom, making the flag's visualization and operation dependent on her own body and knowledge. A pair of horizontal sticks cleaving the unwoven warp, that's those vertical strands in the middle, are the tools used to weave loom with textile. They show Juanita's movement through the weaving, how she chose to weave, and when she chose to stop. Leaving loose yarn bundles embedded in the warp below these rods, Juanita arrests the motion of weaving in the midst of weaving. Through these tools that transform the US flag into a loom, Juanita operates the sign and machine of nation building, even as she refuses them. I weave here and no further. To read the flag, not just as an image or symbol, but as a woven construction of refusal, is to understand Juanita's address as 2 intersecting and competing narratives materialized in the physical intersection of warp strands and weft strands. Okay, too many weaving terms. I'll show you what I mean. When Juanita began Loom with Textile, it looked roughly like this. This and the next few slides are digital renderings of her loom that I manipulated in Photoshop, but they help us visualize the machine of the loom that Juanita both set up and then wove on. Colorful blocks of warp strands with bars on either side and rods in the middle. As soon as Juanita began to weave, these colorful warp strands are concealed by the weaving. The red and white vertical stripes are intersected and covered over by the red and white horizontal stripes of the flag. Because of this concealment, most mid-19th century Navajo weaving was done on a natural undyed warp, but Juanita draws attention to what weaving hides. According to anthropologist Anne Headland, there are few Navajo weavings on record with a color warp and none with a warp blocked into multiple color fields. It's my contention that Juanita, in setting up her loom with this warp, knowingly calls her audience's attention away from the flag, away from her woven imagery, to see what lies below it. She arrests US expansion to make present a narrative that runs counter to it. The woven vertical zigzag stripes, woven in near equivalent colors to that color warp, reinforce this appeal to notice the buried warp. My understanding of Juanita's loom came through my own weaving of her piece in a few different ways. I wanted to show materially what I saw happening in my study of Juanita's burial of the colorful warp strands. In a cross, the pattern of Juanita's zigzag stripes is printed in canvas and woven into and on top of the red and white stripes. I wanted to make a flag that structurally enacted a dependency, but not without unequal power at work. The red and white stripes still dominate both visually and structurally, threatening to take over. But in this piece, I wanted to consider my family history and response to her work. Why am I drawn to Loom with Textile? I saw in this work my own family narrative embedded in the red and white stripes. How has my family also been trapped and rendered invisible by US westward expansion? But how does this flag also structurally depend on my family's movement through it? The colonial and decolonial project of US identity is ongoing in this flag. And in the spirit of ongoing, I'll conclude today with a project that I did last year with Facebook at Untitled Art in San Francisco. This opportunity gave me the chance to weave with fairgoers, to give an embodied and not just visual experience of weaving. Ideally, I wanted to give fairgoers a taste of what Marie had passed to me, and weave not just yarn, but her story, her mother's story, into the hands of strangers that she will probably never meet. Using the backstrap loom technology, I had fairgoers weave in pairs, tensioning the warp off of one another, a strap around each of their hips. Practically, this makes weaving harder because the tension is constantly changing, but on the other hand, it allowed us to work together through each row of weaving. What I found was that in making the fabric, in weaving together, folks had an experience of being able to see weaving differently. Their experience of weaving, already finished on the wall, was changed by weaving themselves. They understood how the weft moves through the warp strands, gets trapped, disappears, only to reappear on the other side of a fabric. They began to trace this motion of the yarn so that this became this. And what was remarkable was not just how quickly folks identified the yarn as indexical to themselves. Hey, that's me, someone would say after examining their trace, their motion marked out in the fill, the weft, but participants saw their weaving as communicative, as records of thought that could be read back, even if not fully grasped. I don't know what I was thinking there. Look what I did. I kept missing that strand. They could trace the line they added, but they could also trace the decisions they made through the line as a narrative story. By the end of the fair, we had an appendage snaking out and over the wall of the booth as each person's weaving was woven into the next. And this is what I would like to suggest, that each person's narrative decisions recorded in the structure of the weaving was not just a way for them to see weaving differently, having a different relationship to the yarn they could then begin to trace as they looked at my weaving on the wall, but that in using an embodied re-storytelling, people entered into and learned ways of restructuring the fabric, the loom, the machine, the terms which I created and gave to them. And this is what is really at stake for me in my art practice. How do I, as an artist, use textiles as a physical material re-storytelling to change the terms, the narratives across generations, to find and disrupt the contours of flower-shaped, pieced together bits of family history and textile archives, to, as Indigenous studies scholar Coley Driscoll argues, unlearn those knowledge systems that are imposed onto our bodies and instead make visible those whose stories go unheard, unseen. Thank you.
That was wonderful, Kira. Thank you so much.
Nancy.
And Eleanor, are you there?
I think so. We're going to start the video. How is it this time?
Perfect.
Oh, yay. Welcome, everybody. I'm so thrilled to hear Kira speak, and I'm also so thrilled to see all of the comments in the chat and just how broadly this textile talk reaches. It's really wonderful. So Kira, I'm listening to you attentively, and one of the things you brought up that was really interesting is that you were talking about listening to the wool and listening to your body, and you were sort of talking a lot about being in your body and sort of intuitive elements of weaving. But most of your projects, I think, are pretty pre-planned, and I'm curious what that interaction is or intersection.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eleanor. So yes, weaving is, especially warp-faced weaving, takes a lot of planning before it ever gets on the loom. It's the designing opportunities, unlike tapestry, are very limited once the warp has been cut and is put on tension. And so what I have to sort of think through is the sort of range of possibilities I hope to achieve within a weaving. And that's usually done on either graph paper or in Photoshop Illustrator, but is done on grids. And then once that happens, I get to the loom and usually change everything. So it absolutely depends on how the material is moving, how easy it is to work with certain materials, how gravity takes over that I didn't anticipate. It's yeah, it's a very different experience sort of at each step, and sort of I try to follow along as Marie told me to sort of listen to what the wool wants to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting because I mean, for the folks out there, I'm an art dealer that's based in San Francisco in Minnesota Street Project, which is a building that houses about 10 other galleries, and Kira is one of the artists we represent, but she's the only artist that does textiles and the only artist I've ever worked with that does textiles. So for me, I've just learned a tremendous amount about the actual techniques that you're using, and then also just about how to kind of look at the work and think about it differently. And one of the things that you do that we've sort of touched on a couple of times in the talk is that you're using multiple different kinds of weaving techniques, and that's something I'd love to hear about. Like, how are you deciding what sort of elements you want to introduce? Are you, when you're adding in the canvas, for example, so that you can actually print out an image and reuse it, or the climbing gym rope that you mentioned?
Yeah, yeah. So I think when especially if I'm working with a textile archive, I'm often using, I'm looking at a photograph, right? I don't actually have the weaving in front of me. Rarely are these either shown or available to be looked at. The Loom with Textile is currently available to be seen at the Smithsonian, the National Museum of the American Indian. But normally I'm working with a digital source image, which means that my sort of first kind of relationship to the image is digital. And what it means to materialize a digital image then is a process I normally start with on a Jacquard loom or with within Photoshop, because it is just easily translatable. It's sort of taking something and moving it one step away from its sort of dematerialized image content and trying to add some yarn to it. And as I'm weaving the image on a Jacquard loom, that's usually when my mind starts kind of moving in other directions. And I'm thinking about how does this then translate to a backstrap loom or a Mapuche loom? And the decision there is often, how big is the piece going to be? What's the tension going to feel like? Yeah, there's considerations that way. Which loom is being occupied with another project right now?
Yeah, logistics. And how did you learn how to do the Jacquard weaving? And how did that interest kind of get going for you, the digital integration of the idea?
I mean, I absolutely sort of love the history of the loom and the intersection with the computer, especially with feminism and thinking about the sort of history of women and technology that way with Ada Lovelace. And so part of the attraction was just kind of thinking about a way that women were embodying gender differently through technology, through the possibility of technology, as well as kind of disrupting a narrative of the history of technology that I'm familiar with, that I've been taught. And so part of it was just kind of that historical opportunity to look at a different narrative. But then also looking at like Leah Cook's work, a Bay Area artist who is just absolutely kind of like transformed what weaving looks like through the Jacquard loom. I was at California College of the Arts and was able to weave on their Jacquard looms and take a lot of my experience kind of working with digital. I had in another life a t-shirt printing business, which I used a lot of graphic designs for, and be able to translate them now into weaving after having mostly woven on Mapuche or backstrap or floor looms. It was a totally different experience. So
fascinating. Oh, here's a question that you had kind of mentioned as a good idea. What's it like to show work in a contemporary art gallery versus like a textile museum? like the one that's presenting today.
Yeah, I think because I'm working, so my training, right, is already kind of confused. I'm a literature person. I'm coming at this from comparative literature, critical studies, and my degree at California College of the Arts was in both departments of visual and critical studies and in fine arts. And so already I sort of like my allegiances were in two places at once, in two different rivers, if you will. So what does it look like to place work in different flows and different historical flows and different trajectories, where it's all sort of part of the same world, but there's definitely sort of certain considerations or lenses by which different communities or groups are thinking through pieces. And I really enjoy that conversation. So being able to show the same work in an art gallery context versus a textile museum, or presenting that work at a comparative literature conference is going to elicit a totally different conversation and force me to think through the kind of what I'm focusing on and how I'm talking about things.
What's interesting to me, actually, so hearing you talk about that makes total sense, is that when you have shown with a gallery or with an art fair, which you could argue an art fair is an incredibly elite version of seeing art. I mean, it costs money to enter the fair. Most of the pieces at the fair are very expensive. Untitled specifically is quite expensive. But what you chose to do with that is make it a totally egalitarian, democratic process where people could come in and actually interact with your weaving and weave.
Yeah.
And you've done a lot of teaching. You did a demonstration here at the Minnesota Street Project as well, where you did that. And I think that's really interesting. I think you demystified it a lot. I'm sure you did that on purpose, but I want to hear about why you're choosing to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it is this idea of what it means to store information, which I think we're all familiar with, right? Like, how do we store a lot of dematerial information on our computers and in the cloud, wherever it goes, and don't necessarily have it connected to our bodies, the sort of physical, tangible objects. And so what does, as well as like the physical sort of like making of those objects. And so how does it become different when we can understand how information or decisions get stored that then can be told back to us in a very different way than like if something's written down or photographed, that the visual image and writing sometimes are harder for our bodies to find ways of changing, especially when you're looking for just like struggling for the words. The thing I love about textiles is like when something gets messy, it gets interesting. And usually in language, when something gets messy, it's just hard to listen to. So,
true. Should we look at other questions from our folks listening? I don't know if we've asked for that yet. Did we want to bring that into the fray?
Sure. No, we have lots of questions. Several people have just wondered, are the materials you use repurposed? And if you use found fibers, how does that influence the story that the piece tells?
Yeah. No, thanks. So absolutely. I love to work with found fibers, whether that's, so I'm a new resident of Chicago and I came during the pandemic, so I don't actually know a lot of the kind of fun art spaces that are here. But in the Bay Area, Urban Ore was a repurposing site for a lot of industrial and urban materials. And I just absolutely loved that as my first yarn store. And part of that is because I've spent the time in Argentina weaving with Marie and thinking about tension, sort of a loom as tension. It was whatever material was at hand became that tensioning device. And so sort of like what is most available to me living in the city is the recycled found objects that are laying on the ground. So often during a bike ride, I'll grab a pole if I see it and think it might be useful, or a broomstick, and think that that'll be a useful material at some point. I also I really like going to the Textile Center in Minnesota. I have a lot of family there, and they have a huge collection of donated yarns that are often never going to be found right in a yarn store, and they're hand spun, or they're like Harrisville yarns but from the 60s. And I love like encountering these yarns, especially the way they're talked about. The packaging to me is really interesting. One day I'll have to do a piece about that. So for a rose, for instance, I used marigold yarn and primitive rose and these kinds of colors to sort of mix in with hand spun wool or wool that I'd collected sort of in my travels. So I do a mix of a lot of different materials. Yeah.
Do we have other questions too you wanted to bring in? There's our chat window.
Hi, everyone. I think Nancy went offline for a minute, so I'm going to hop in with a question. How do you store these pieces when they are not on exhibit?
That is a wonderful question. So oftentimes, because I work and live in small spaces, textiles, I think like Faith Ringgold once said this, the reason why she switched to quilting was because she could, like, instead of having to stretch her canvases, she could roll it up and take it with her. And I am absolutely in agreement that when these come off of the wall, even though they appear to be sort of like very structured, stable fabrics, anywhere you see a rod, I'll slip yarn in. Usually t-shirt string is sort of my material of choice to hold loops or hold spaces where I want to put a rod back in, so that the fabric gets totally deconstructed, it gets rolled up, usually in organic cotton sheeting, and stored in a closet on shelves. And then when it goes back to the gallery, I bring all of those installation materials back with me, and I'm usually rebuilding a piece. So installation generally takes me at least a day or two to reconstruct a piece back in the gallery. Because I mean, some of these pieces are like a rose like 10 feet, 12 feet tall, and I don't have the space to even, like the studio I'm in now, to set that up.
All right, one more question. Can you talk about the ways your experiences as a graduate student and other formal instruction influenced the way you came to think about your art approaches? And can you point to any textile artists that have been particularly influential on your work?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. That's a great question. So one of the reasons why I went to CCA was because I was tired of weaving and having a conversation with myself in my living room. I wanted to be able to have an opportunity to share the conversations that I missed having with Marie and other weavers in Argentina. And I should say, when I was in Berkeley, I also was part of a weaving group that they had tea every Wednesday, so I could go and meet with them. But I wanted to just keep expanding that conversation, sort of hopefully have the opportunity to do it more often, even as a living. And so going to CCA was really instrumental in helping me understand how a lot of my experiences then connected to contemporary art. And critical studies was really crucial for me that way, because I had already understood sort of the way that I articulated and thought about the world through literature. But then thinking about how visual or written critical studies can actually translate to material critical studies was sort of like, wow, a light bulb moment. I can take both of these things and put it together. And so artists then that I look at a lot of artists, but who are thinking through this are everyone from like Lenore Tawney and Olga de Amaral to more recent artists. Melissa Cody is one who I just think is amazing. She recently won the Bradford Elliott Textile Society of America Award, but has also won the Santa Fe Indian Market, and has also had a residency at the De Young. So in terms of an artist being able to take her weaving, she's a Navajo weaver, into so many different spaces and really challenge the conversations that are being had around what contemporary Navajo weaving looks like is just amazing. And so those are artists. This is an artist that I wouldn't have been exposed to had I not necessarily gone to graduate school. It just made the conversation bigger.
Yeah, it's interesting. It really feels like we're hitting a moment where people are very ready to see textile in the commercial art world in a way that maybe 10 years ago I don't feel that they were. Mm-hmm. It's just a sort of vocabulary and a way of making something that I feel like people are wanting to reconnect with, things that are tactile, tangible, that feel like there's craft involved, without craft being like a capital C or a lowercase c, and without much judgment around that term. Or I feel like maybe 10 years ago there was judgment about it. So that's been an interesting trajectory to kind of see your work enter into this particular version of the art world and the commercial side of things, and it be kind of barrier free, where I don't feel like that was true 10 years ago. And I'm curious if you have opinions about that, or Samantha, if you do from the museum side, like how that's shifted.
I mean, I look at someone like Consuelo Jimenez Underwood, who is a San Jose artist, who has been able to push sort of a textile conversation from where it began within contemporary art, of thinking about sort of how does women as a gender category start pushing institutional narratives. And her work comes along and says, yes, and how does being a Chicana and an indigenous Chicana also push that narrative in a different direction? And so sort of challenging and making, and being able to tell that story really through weaving as well as her wall murals. She's taking craft and sort of showing the importance of the way that it still forms our understanding of a lot of these terms, like women and immigrant and indigenous making and all of these kinds of things. And so being able to help materialize that conversation, I think is actually why textiles is so interesting right now within so many different spaces. But I've always thought it's been interesting.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned Consuelo's work, and we'll put her name and information in the chat. But we are honored to host a show of Consuelo Jimenez Underwood's work next summer at our museum, and also show her influence on 3 of her students' work. So showing the next generation of textile artists and her influence. We're thrilled for that show. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll pass it off to Nancy, who's now back online. When working on a project, do you see the end at the beginning, or does that end evolve as you are working on the project? And I'd love to know how that also, that question in terms of your installation and hanging of these pieces too.
Right. And that's a great question, because I kind of had already thought, a piece is only finished once it's in the gallery or in the museum, or someone else is seeing it when it gets out of the studio and installed that way for a public context. But it really became, especially because I was working with looms even more so than fabric, that I needed to understand the way that the architecture then was influencing and holding the cloth, how the architecture became another loom, another tensioning device in which I could work. So the end goal, yes, I have ideas, but it doesn't really come together for me fully until I get into whatever space it's going to be seen. And that's really come to a head during this pandemic, because a lot of my work is sitting half finished right now in the studio, because I'm not quite sure where to go with it yet. It really, to me, depends on where is this going to be seen, who's going to see it, what's the history, the architecture that surrounds it, because that's going to determine how I can enter in and finish this fabric. It's hard for me to sort of make work ambivalent to its environment, which makes then seeing the end challenging.
Sorry, internet went down the first time in a year. It knew. So there was a comment in the chat. Someone said this was the most meaningful and personal talk on textiles I've ever heard.
Oh.
And it was very meaningful. And you are incredibly talented at literally weaving your cultural background into your artwork. What advice would you give to those who want to communicate similar concepts of identity, background, and family?
Nice, thanks. I mean, definitely starting with the source if it's available, right? So talking with family members. Because of the work I've started receiving little, bits of cloth and other clothing from other family members. Sort of, why is grandma getting all the attention kind of question. And so I think once you make it known to the family that you're interested, you will be inundated and in a good way. But also even without that, right? Like if what you're left with is photographs, or the sort of like uncanny little statements that you maybe have grown up hearing, but you're not quite sure, like, what that means. For instance, my mom's sort of word, this was acceptable, right? I did what was acceptable in my generation, which is something that I had heard a lot, but didn't really like have a chance to sit with and think about until I was making these pieces. And that's one thing I love about weaving, right? It gives you time to reflect. And so any kind of sort of making intervention, if you will, that you want to have with these very conceptual ideas, right? The family stories are usually so ethereal and so in between generations. They don't, especially if it's trauma, right? It's the sort of thing that it's hard to talk about. So you'll get it in different ways, and it might just sit in the air, and it might not be a way that the person who experienced the trauma in their generation can even fully articulate, right? But it's something that you've felt because you've grown up with it. And so starting to give yourself space to think through that. And for me, that time happens materially. It's in some ways very much a cathartic and healing process, right? To get these stories out of the sort of intangible and really give all of us something to hold on to and push against, right? It's not that I think I have a definitive answer to what happened in my family. My mom cringes at a lot of the things that I say or the way that I articulate these stories, and she's generous enough at the same time to allow me to sort of keep going and keep playing with it. And so there's that tension as well. But yeah.
It's really, really very profound. Wow. So if somebody already asked, if Sam already asked this question, thanks Sam for stepping in. So many weavers talk about their aha moment when they kind of learn the basics and their artistic practices forever changed. Did you have that moment, and that's what led you to CCA, California College for the Arts, because they do have such a strong textile background, and you mentioned Leah Cook, who is a teacher there. So I guess a two-part. Did you have an aha moment? Is that what brought you to CCA? And part two is, were there other either textile artists or artists in other media who influenced your work?
Thanks. So yes, yes to all of it. The aha moment, I think, happened weaving with Mari in Argentina. I had sort of always done making. I loved quilting and sewing and making clothes and knitting and crocheting and felting, sort of like all the textile practices, and even a little bit of weaving, but mostly tapestry. But it wasn't until that I heard the way she talked about weaving, the way she talked about her family through weaving, that it really was like, oh wow, like this sounds like a lot of the kind of like critical studies things I've been reading. Like, this sounds like Homi Bhabha in a third space, but now I'm seeing it on a loom without anything written anywhere. This is strange. And so that was definitely the aha moment. And being in a culture, it was in Southern Patagonia, where there wasn't sort of Target or fabric stores available. And so people actually like recognized cloth that was being made, and sort of realizing that when I was walking down the street, people could say, oh, you wove with Sera Inalef or Mari Coronado. Like, I can recognize the maker's hands on your body. And that was shocking. And so coming back to California and being in Berkeley, I just felt very isolated. The sort of things that were really important to me, there was nobody who was like, who cared to look at these sort of intersections of warp and weft fiber. And so I went in search of those people who did. And thankfully, being in the Bay Area, there were quite a few. And so then I was able to start having those conversations and pushing kind of what I was interested in and intersecting it, mostly with a floor loom, right? Most people who had learned how to weave through a floor loom learned how to weave through California College of the Arts program. And so then I started kind of taking those steps. And I was really interested in sort of performance and storytelling when I started thinking about graduate school. So Deborah Voloma is the chair of the textile department, and a lot of her work with textiles in tension, but in dance, was what really drew me to that program initially. And then since then, you know, we've had our conversations go all over the place. Yeah, so that was definitely kind of what what sort of had me taking my first steps towards contemporary art. I think Ann Wilson's work was hugely influential, seeing her sort of walking the warp performances that she did. And she's a professor emeritus here at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Eleanor, for joining us. Thank you, Kira, for this wonderful presentation. Really inspiring. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. I also want to thank our sponsors again for supporting this event and remind you all to please patronize them when you can. We will be sharing this presentation on YouTube and Facebook afterwards. And again, if you enjoyed the talk and you would like to donate or become a member of any of our organizations, please visit our website or the other websites and join us next Wednesday for our presentation with the Modern Quilt Guild. And we look forward to seeing you then. Take care and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.